Story 1: The Whispering Walls. The mall had been dead for over a decade, but it still breathed. Elliot Grayson stood at the edge of the parking lot, his boots crunching over broken glass and weeds that had long since claimed the asphalt. The structure loomed before him, a hulking relic of the 1980s, its once vibrant facade now a patchwork of peeling paint and shattered windows. The sign above the entrance, faded to a ghostly gray, still bore the name, Silver Pines Mall. Elliot had driven past it 100 times, maybe more, on his way to and from work. He'd never given it much thought, just another casualty of the economic downturn, another tombstone in the graveyard of consumerism. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, the mall called to him. It started with a dream. 3 nights ago, Elliot had woken in a cold sweat, the image of the mall burned into his mind. In the dream, he'd been standing inside, the stores lit up as if they were still in business, the air filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the chatter of shoppers. But there was something wrong. The people, if you could call them that, were shadows, their faces blurred, their voices a low, guttural murmur. And the walls were alive. They pulsed like flesh, and from them came whispers. "Elliot. Come inside, Elliot. We've been waiting for you." He dismissed it as stress. After all, his life was a mess. His wife, Sarah, had left him 6 months ago, taking their daughter, Lily, with her. The divorce papers had arrived last week, and he'd been drinking more than he should, trying to numb the pain. But the dream kept coming back, each night more vivid than the last. And each time, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. So here he was, standing in the shadow of the mall, a flashlight in one hand and a half-empty bottle of whiskey in the other. He didn't know why he'd come. Maybe to prove to himself that it was just a dream, that the mall was just a building, nothing more. Or maybe, deep down, he wanted it to be real. He wanted to hear the whispers again, to feel that strange, electric pull that had drawn him here. The front doors were chained shut, but one of them hung slightly ajar, just enough for Elliot to squeeze through. He hesitated, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a scene of utter desolation. The floor was littered with debris, broken tiles, shattered glass, and the skeletal remains of store displays. The ceiling sagged in places, water dripping from the cracks and pooling on the ground. Elliot moved slowly, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. He passed by what had once been a food court, the chairs and tables overturned, the fountain dry and filled with trash. The stores were like open wounds, their interiors gutted, their signs hanging crookedly above the entrances. And then he heard it. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing, but it was there. A single word, spoken in a voice that was both familiar and alien. "Elliot." He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound had come from behind him. He turned, sweeping the flashlight beam across the empty corridor. Nothing. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. The whisper came again, this time from his left. "Come closer." He followed the sound, his footsteps quickening. The whispers grew louder, more numerous, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. "We've missed you. You belong here. Stay with us." Elliot's breath came in short, ragged gasps. He was running now, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he sprinted down the corridor. The whispers were everywhere, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. They were inside his head, filling his mind with their insidious words. He stumbled into a large, open space, the mall's central atrium. The ceiling soared above him, a lattice of steel and glass that let in the faint light of the moon. In the center of the room was a fountain, its basin filled with murky water. And standing in the water was a figure. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The figure was tall and thin, its body shrouded in a tattered cloak. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Elliot could feel its eyes on him, burning into his soul. "Welcome home, Elliot," the figure said, its voice a low, guttural growl. Elliot took a step back, his mind screaming at him to run, but his feet refused to obey. The figure raised a hand, pointing to the walls of the atrium. "Look," it commanded. Elliot turned his head, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The walls were moving. They pulsed and writhed like living flesh, their surface covered in a network of veins and arteries. And from them came the whispers, 1,000 voices speaking in unison, their words a symphony of madness. "You're one of us now. You'll never leave. This is where you belong." Elliot's vision blurred, the walls closing in around him. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something were trying to claw its way out. He dropped the flashlight, the beam flickering and dying as it hit the ground. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the figure in the fountain, its face finally revealed. It was his own. When Elliot woke, he was lying on the floor of the atrium, the first light of dawn filtering through the broken ceiling. His head throbbed, and his body felt heavy, as if he'd been drained of all his strength. The whispers were gone, the walls silent and still. But as he struggled to his feet, he noticed something strange. The walls, once covered in graffiti and grime, were now pristine, their surface smooth and unblemished. And in the center of the atrium, the fountain was flowing, the water clear and sparkling. Elliot stumbled toward the exit, his mind reeling. He needed to get out, to leave this place and never come back. But as he reached the doors, he heard it again. A whisper. "You'll be back." He ran, his heart pounding in his chest, and didn't stop until he was back in his car, speeding down the empty highway. But even as he drove, the whispers followed him, a constant, insidious presence in the back of his mind. And he knew, deep down, that they were right. He would be back. Over the next few weeks, Elliot tried to convince himself that it had all been a hallucination, a product of stress and too much whiskey. But the whispers never left him. They were there when he woke up in the morning, there when he went to bed at night. They were there when he was at work, when he was driving, when he was trying to eat or sleep or think. And they were growing louder. "Come back to us. You belong here. We're waiting for you." Elliot tried to resist, tried to ignore the pull that drew him back to the mall. But it was no use. The whispers were too strong, too insistent. And so, one night, he found himself standing in the parking lot once again, the mall looming before him like a living thing. This time, the doors were wide open, as if they'd been expecting him. Elliot stepped inside, the whispers growing louder with each step. The mall was different now, the walls clean and bright, the stores filled with merchandise. The air was filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the chatter of shoppers. But the people were shadows, their faces blurred, their voices a low, guttural murmur. And the walls were alive. Elliot moved through the mall, the whispers guiding him, drawing him deeper into its heart. He passed by stores he remembered from his childhood, their names and logos familiar but somehow wrong. And then he saw it. A store he didn't recognize, its sign written in a language he couldn't understand. The whispers were coming from inside, a chorus of voices calling to him. "Come inside, Elliot. This is where you belong." Elliot stepped through the doorway, and the world around him dissolved into darkness. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in a long, narrow corridor, the walls lined with doors. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and decay. And then he remembered. This wasn't a mall. It was an asylum. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as Elliot moved down the corridor, each step taking him closer to the truth. The doors began to open, one by one, revealing the horrors within. Rooms filled with broken furniture, blood-stained walls, and the twisted remains of those who had once been patients. And in the last room, at the end of the corridor, he found it. The source of the whispers. It was a mass of flesh and bone, a grotesque amalgamation of human bodies, their faces twisted in agony. And from it came the whispers, 1,000 voices speaking in unison, their words a symphony of madness. You're one of us now. You'll never leave. This is where you belong. Elliot tried to scream, but no sound came out. The mass reached for him, its tendrils wrapping around his body, pulling him closer. And as the darkness took him, he realized the truth. The mall had never been a mall. It had always been an asylum. And he had always been a patient. Elliot Grayson was never seen again. The mall, now condemned and slated for demolition, stands empty, its walls silent once more. But if you listen closely, in the dead of night, you might hear them. The whispers. And if you do, beware. Because they're calling for you. Story 2: The Shadow in the Window. The house on the edge of Black Hollow had always been a place of whispers. It stood alone, a crooked sentinel at the end of a dirt road that seemed to dissolve into the woods. The locals called it the Widow's Watch, though no one could remember why. Some said it was because the last owner had spent her final years staring out the upstairs window, waiting for a husband who never came home from the war. Others said it was because the house itself was waiting, for what, no one could say. When Claire Bennett moved in, she didn't believe in ghosts. She didn't believe in curses or haunted houses or shadows that moved when no one was there to cast them. She was a practical woman, a writer seeking solitude after a year that had left her hollowed out and raw. Her divorce had been messy, her career was in shambles, and the weight of her failures pressed down on her like a stone. The house was cheap, and the real estate agent had been eager to get it off her hands. Claire didn't ask why. The first night, she slept fitfully. The wind howled through the trees, and the old house groaned like a living thing. She told herself it was just the settling of the foundation, the creak of aging wood. But as she lay in the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. It started with the window. The house had a large bay window in the living room, overlooking the woods. Claire had fallen in love with it during the tour, imagining herself sitting there with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise. But now, in the dead of night, the window seemed less inviting. She woke to the sound of tapping, faint but insistent, like fingernails against glass. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The tapping stopped. Just the wind, she muttered, pulling the blankets tighter around her. But the words felt hollow, even to her. The next morning, she inspected the window. There were no tree branches close enough to tap against the glass, no birds nesting on the sill. She told herself it was her imagination, the product of an overactive mind and too much caffeine. But as the days passed, the tapping became a constant presence, always at the edge of her awareness. Then came the shadow. It was late afternoon, and Claire was working at her desk, trying to focus on the blank page in front of her. The tapping had started again, louder this time, and she was doing her best to ignore it. She glanced up, her eyes drawn to the window, and that's when she saw it. A figure stood outside, just beyond the glass. It was tall and thin, its features blurred as if seen through a fogged mirror. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching her. She blinked, and it was gone. For a long moment, she sat perfectly still, her mind racing. Had she imagined it? It wouldn't be the first time her stress had conjured something out of nothing. But the image lingered, burned into her mind like a photograph. That night, she locked all the doors and windows, something she hadn't bothered to do before. She told herself it was just a precaution, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. The house felt different now, colder, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The shadow returned the next day. Claire was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when she felt the weight of someone's gaze on her. She turned, her hands still wet, and there it was, standing in the living room. This time, it was closer, its features slightly clearer. She could make out the hollows of its eyes, the sharp angle of its jaw. It looked almost human, but not quite. She dropped the plate she was holding, and it shattered on the floor. The sound seemed to startle the shadow, and it vanished, melting into the darkness like smoke. Claire didn't sleep that night. She sat on the couch, a baseball bat in her lap, staring at the window. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt heavy, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. By morning, she was exhausted, her nerves frayed. She considered leaving, packing her things and driving as far away from the house as she could. But something kept her there, a stubbornness she couldn't explain. She had come to the house to escape her past, to find some semblance of peace. She wouldn't let a shadow, real or imagined, chase her away. Over the next few days, the shadow became a constant presence. It appeared at the edges of her vision, always watching, always silent. Claire tried to ignore it, throwing herself into her work, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind was a jumble of fear and doubt, and the shadow seemed to feed on it, growing bolder with each passing day. Then came the dreams. They were vivid, almost too real, filled with images of the shadow standing over her bed, its hollow eyes staring into hers. In the dreams, it spoke, its voice a low, guttural whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "You can't run from me," it said. "I'm already inside." Claire woke screaming, her sheets drenched in sweat. She told herself it was just a nightmare, but the words lingered, echoing in her mind like a curse. The final straw came one night when she was in the bathroom, brushing her teeth. She caught a glimpse of the shadow in the mirror, standing behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. When she looked back at the mirror, the shadow was still there, its face twisted into a grotesque smile. She ran from the house, not bothering to grab her coat or shoes. The cold bit into her skin as she stumbled down the dirt road, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of town, where she collapsed on the steps of the local diner. The waitress inside took one look at her and called the sheriff. Claire tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumbled mess. The sheriff listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded and said, "You're not the first to see it." Claire stared at him, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" The sheriff sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That house, it's got a history. Folks around here say it's cursed. Everyone who's lived there has seen something, shadows, figures, things that shouldn't be there. Most don't last more than a few weeks. Why didn't anyone tell me?" Claire demanded, her voice shaking. The sheriff shrugged. "Figured you wouldn't believe it. Most don't, at first." Claire didn't go back to the house that night. She stayed in a motel on the edge of town, staring at the ceiling as the hours dragged by. She thought about leaving, about packing her things and never looking back. But something kept pulling her back, a nagging feeling she couldn't shake. The next morning, she returned to the house. The sheriff had offered to go with her, but she declined. This was something she had to do alone. The house was quiet when she stepped inside, the air thick with tension. She moved through the rooms slowly, her senses on high alert. The shadow was there, waiting for her in the living room. This time, it didn't vanish. Claire stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadow stepped closer, its features becoming clearer. She could see the hollows of its eyes, the sharp angle of its jaw. It looked almost human, but not quite. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow smiled, its lips curling into a grotesque grin. "I'm you," it said, its voice a low, guttural whisper. Claire shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, no, you're not." The shadow stepped closer, its hollow eyes staring into hers. "You can't run from me," it said. I'm already inside. And then it was on her, its cold hands wrapping around her throat. Claire struggled, but the shadow was too strong. She felt herself being pulled into the darkness, her screams swallowed by the void. When the sheriff found her the next day, she was sitting in front of the window, staring out at the woods. Her eyes were empty, her face pale. She didn't respond when he called her name, didn't react when he touched her shoulder. The house on the edge of Black Hollow had claimed another victim. And the shadow in the window watched, waiting for the next one to come. Story 3: The House That Dreams. The house on Eldridge Street had always been there, or so it seemed. It loomed at the end of the cul-de-sac like a forgotten relic, its gabled roof sagging under the weight of time and its windows staring out like hollow eyes. The neighborhood kids called it the widow's house, though no one could remember why. Some said a woman had died there, her grief so profound it seeped into the walls. Others whispered that the house itself was alive, feeding on the sorrow of those who dared to enter. When my grandmother passed away, I inherited the house. I hadn't seen her in years, she'd been a recluse, living alone in that crumbling Victorian monstrosity. But her will was clear, the house was mine, along with a cryptic note that read, "Be careful what you dream." I moved in on a gray October afternoon, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. The air smelled of damp leaves and decay, and the house seemed to exhale as I stepped onto the creaking porch. The key turned in the lock with a groan, and the door swung open as if it had been waiting for me. The interior was a time capsule of faded wallpaper, moth-eaten curtains, and furniture shrouded in dusty sheets. My footsteps echoed as I explored, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The house felt aware. It was as if the walls were leaning in, listening, watching. That first night, I dreamed of the house. I was standing in the foyer, just as I had that afternoon, but the air was colder, sharper. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, and I could hear whispers, soft, insidious murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I climbed the stairs, my hand gripping the banister, which felt unnaturally warm, almost alive. At the top of the stairs was a door I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, and a faint, golden light spilled from the crack. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and circular, with walls covered in strange symbols that pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. In the center of the room was a chair, and sitting in the chair was me. But it wasn't me. It was a version of me, twisted and wrong. Its eyes were black voids, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It raised a hand and pointed at me, and I woke up screaming. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding, my skin slick with sweat. The room was dark, but I could feel something cold and heavy pressing down on me. I fumbled for the lamp, and when the light flickered on, I saw them. Marks. On my arms, my chest, my legs, thin, red lines, like scratches. They didn't hurt, but they were there, undeniable. I stared at them, my mind racing. Had I done this to myself in my sleep? Or had something else? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The days that followed were uneventful, but the nights were something else. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself back in that house, in that room. The twisted version of me was always there, waiting. Sometimes it spoke, its voice a guttural rasp that made my skin crawl. "You belong here," it said one night. "You always have." I woke up with more marks, deeper this time. I tried to rationalize it. Stress, sleepwalking, some kind of subconscious self-harm. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. The house was doing something to me, something I couldn't explain. I started researching the house, digging through old records and newspaper archives. What I found made my blood run cold. The house had been built in 1897 by a man named Elias Hargrove, a wealthy industrialist with a fascination for the occult. He'd designed the house himself, incorporating strange architectural elements and symbols that no one could explain. After his wife died under mysterious circumstances, Hargrove became a recluse, rarely leaving the house. When he died, the house passed to his daughter, who also died young. The pattern continued for generations, each owner meeting an untimely end, each death more bizarre than the last. My grandmother had been the last in that line. I found her journal in the attic, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The pages were brittle with age, the handwriting shaky but legible. "The house is alive," she wrote. "It feeds on fear, on pain, on dreams. It takes pieces of you, bit by bit, until there's nothing left. I've tried to fight it, but it's too strong. It knows my fears, my regrets, my darkest secrets. It uses them against me. I can feel it inside my mind, twisting my thoughts, turning them against me. I don't know how much longer I can hold on." The journal ended abruptly, the final entry dated just days before her death. That night, I dreamed of the house again. This time, the twisted version of me wasn't alone. There were others, shadows of people, their faces blurred and indistinct. They surrounded me, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Join us," they said. "You belong here." I tried to run, but the room seemed to stretch and warp, the walls closing in. The twisted version of me lunged forward, its hands clawing at my face. I woke up with a scream, my body covered in fresh marks. But this time, something was different. I could still hear the whispers. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there. And they weren't just in my head, they were coming from the walls. I pressed my ear against the wallpaper, my heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Let us in," they said. "Let us in." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The house was alive. It was feeding on me, just as it had fed on my grandmother, on all the others who had lived here. I knew I had to get out. But as I turned to leave, I saw it, the door. The one from my dreams. It was there, in the hallway, where it hadn't been before. I don't know what compelled me to open it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else, something the house had planted in my mind. The room was just as I had seen it in my dreams, the symbols pulsing faintly on the walls. In the center of the room was the chair, and sitting in the chair was me. But it wasn't the twisted version of me. It was me, as I was now, my eyes wide with terror. "You can't leave," it said. "The house won't let you." I woke up screaming, but this time, I wasn't in my bed. I was in the chair. The walls were closing in, the whispers growing louder. I could feel the house inside my mind, twisting my thoughts, feeding on my fear. And then I saw them, the others. They were all around me, their faces twisted in agony. "Join us," they said. "You belong here." I don't know how long I've been here. Days? Weeks? Time doesn't mean anything in this place. The house feeds on my dreams, on my fears, on my memories. It's taking pieces of me, bit by bit, until there's nothing left. But sometimes, when the whispers grow quiet, I can hear something else, a faint, desperate voice. It's my voice. And it's screaming for help. If you ever find yourself on Eldridge Street, don't stop. Don't look at the house. Don't even think about it. Because the house is always watching. And it's always hungry.